Let's just reset.
It's this professionalism that we really wanted to establish here. I just asked Martin whether he's recording this.
Yeah. So mind hacks, overcome the fear of failure, right? So as I was just talking about, I've published 3 books. I'm on my 4th business. I just spent 4 years with no income working on decision making, the psychology of it, how we apply meaning in life, what it all actually means and how this brain is actually built. I've written a paper for the Prime Minister about addiction. I put on the world's first event at Westminster Abbey. And I'm actually not bragging. What I'm actually going to share with you is that my entire life, I've had massive fraud syndrome. And I've come across this in people time and time again. I actually think that it's way more common in people than what we might think. And that's what I want to cover today, is how can we overcome this fear of failure? And I'll be giving some examples about how I've done it. But more than that, it's going to be about how you can understand yourself better and make some choices. Not change, but just make some choices, because that's the goal of any kind of awareness about how this brain operates and how you are yourself as you are at the moment. So, gap in the matrix, I'm going to give you a super quick download matrix style, right? So, first of all, you'll probably recognize this guy. If not, this is Socrates Johnson, to use the Bill and Ted or moniker, or in other words, Socrates, right? So, he asks a great question, the Socratic strategy of how you can examine anything. And you basically take the what is, and then you add the word in front of it. So the first thing to understand about mindset is that it's only how your mind is set right now. So there's a lot of false understanding in society about how our mind operates. It's like, that's my DNA. That's just how I am. That's how I was born. And don't get me wrong, there's a biological and chemical disposition that we've all got, and that's the nature side of what we get. Our willpower, our determination, a lot of that is inherent in what we get given. Everything else is completely and utterly malleable, because your mindset is a set of patterns of behavior. So I'll give you an example, right? So the efficiency trick, as I call this, is that the brain is an organ, and it's set up to automate as much of what you do as possible. And it wants to automate all of that in where the power of the brain sits, which is not your conscious mind. It's actually everything that goes on unconsciously. So the things that you're not aware of. So here's some examples. So if you think about the first time that you learned how to tie your shoelaces. So it was left over, right over, middle, left over, right over, middle. You got shown a few times, then you tried it and you messed it up. You tried it, you got it right, you messed it up a couple more times, and then boom, you got it right, and it goes into your system, right? And it moves from being something you learn to a behavior. Once you master it, it becomes a habit, right? And we know that because when we get up, we've got millions of these different habits. We know how to button our shirts. We know how to dress ourselves. We know how to make the perfect morning cup of tea or cup of coffee or whatever that is. But the thing about habits is that a lot of them come into our system without us ever knowing and leave as a habit without us ever knowing. So the way that we select people, who we hang out with, what we wear, what we eat, all these little nuances, including how we think, is all done in a habitual way. So I'll give you one more example. So let's say that you want to be healthy, right? We've all tried to change our diet at different times. So let's say that you have a morning cup of coffee, and at the moment you have a muffin with it every single day. And then you say, right, I'm going to try and be healthy. I'm going to have an apple with it. And the first day you manage it, you have an apple with your tea break. And then the next day you go back to having a muffin. The next day you have an apple. And the next day you're back to having muffins time and time again. The challenge is that the brain is basically set up to automate as much as possible, which means it doesn't like change. And by you just saying a simple thing like swapping an apple for a muffin, that's not how it operates, because you're actually asking it to change over 1,000 different neural pathways, because there's many different reasons why you eat that muffin. It might be a sugar release, it might be dopamine, you might have had a bad diet when you were a kid, it might be the psychological equivalent of getting a cuddle. There's all kinds of different reasons why you do it. So the first lesson is to understand that everything that you do is automated, because that's the brain's job. And the brain is not doing it because it's the best thing for you to do. The brain is doing it because it's an organ and it wants to automate a lot. How does that affect your fear and your fear of failure? Well, I want to give you one example. So what I want you to do is just shout out, or you can just type in chat, whichever you want to do. When you see this next slide, I want you to shout out, type in the chat, the very first thing that comes to mind. Ready? Go. What do you see, Phil?
Threat.
The vast majority of people are going to do what Scott just put into the chat. and that's going to say a tiger. So this is a psychology test, not from my business, just a general, done by a university. 83% of people that are raised in the East, which is going to be the vast majority of people not on this call, will say a tiger in the jungle. Because from the youngest age, they're taught to look at the relationship of things. So the way that people go out in the East is that they're looking at the relationship of everything that they see. Whereas in the West, we're taught to look for the most dominant object. So 86% of people will say a tiger. What's my point about this? Is that when you look at life, it's never other people. Like, this is what the mind does, right? We're always like, oh, I don't feel that like life's working out for me. This is what my mind does anyway, right? So you're like, I don't feel that I'm getting any luck. I feel that life is against me. I feel that these mystical people are against me. And this arises because our fear factor is designed around how we interpret everything to do with the world. This black box that you can see on the screen is literally how your mind is set. And where that starts to account for your fear factor is that you have to look at what fear actually is. Like, why are we scared to try things? A big part about it comes down to that our brain wants to defend us, right? So the efficiency trick means that it automates as much as possible for us to survive. And despite what we get told in the news and about technology and AI and all this kind of stuff, the evolution of the human thinking and how it's set up in the brain has changed very little from the caveman days. So our survival instinct has not adapted for the past 50 years, where there's been a lot of technological change, there's been a lot of income change, there's been a lot of change in terms of our access to what we can consume. So it's relatively easy for most people to have the right amount of food in the cupboard, the right amount of heating in their houses. So our survival instinct still exists, but the reason of what it's pointed at doesn't make as much sense in the modern world. So our survival instinct comes into play when we've got this fear of failure, because the reason being is that we want to survive and we want to be safe. So we hold ourselves back. Nobody else, not those mythical people, not anybody that's got any luck against you. It's just literally how your mind is currently set about whether you want to try something or not. And of course, what is that fear? We fear failure. We fear judgment. So it's much better to stay safe, because humans love a little bit of judgment. But the reality is, this is what we need. I've always tried to live my life, and it's not always been easy, but I've always tried to live my life with no regrets. And in order for you to have no regrets in life, you need to have the courage to try, because I can guarantee you, it's a lot better to try something and sometimes not get it right than never find out the outcome. So for me, the number one rule that I want you to take away from this is what I call the Dr. Pepper rule. And that's what's the worst that could happen. And this happened a number of years ago. My wife is, as I mentioned at the start when we were joking about, she's got a massive lexicon. She's way smarter than what I am. She's actually got some real education and stuff as well. So she's quite dangerous in our house. So she bosses everything, right? The point about my wife is that she came to me about 10 years ago, roughly speaking. And she said, I keep going to these meetings and I've got these ideas and I don't share them. And it's really frustrating me. And I said, well, why don't you share them? And she said, well, everybody in the room is more senior than I. And I said, do you mean that they're older or just job titles? And she said, well, mainly just job titles. Some of them are obviously older than me. And I said to her, what's the worst that can happen? If you share that idea, the number one thing is that people are going to notice you, and they're going to notice that idea. It doesn't have to be the best world-changing idea, but the number one thing that I want you to take away from this is that if you don't break the habit and give it a try, you'll never know what you could achieve in life. And nobody wants to get to their deathbed sitting there saying, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd tried. So the fear of failure, the takeaway for today, is only a manifestation in your head. It's up to you to ask the questions and challenge yourself about what you could be, what you could try, and what effort you could make behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It's really interesting to talk about failure and fear of failure, because I think so many of us, we talk about failing fast in business. We talk about embracing failure, which I always say when I'm speaking that businesses talk about embracing failure, but actually what they're really good at is embracing blame. Or embracing failure is easy until you actually experience failure, and then it's really really difficult. So in that spirit, and thinking about maybe some of the stuff we've also talked about this week about trying and doing and failing fast and all that kind of stuff. What is your advice for anybody seeking to manage fear within their own businesses? And how would you inspire people who are struggling to manage fear within their own businesses to, how would you tell them to help encourage their people to move forward?
So I think the biggest thing from a leadership point of view is that there's the psychology of permission, right? And it's a very literal thing. You wouldn't believe the freedom that happens within an organization when people feel free to express themselves. And I'm not talking about you sending emails saying we're looking for ideas. I'm talking about literally people understanding that ideas are good, that it's part of your agenda within meetings, it's part of the problem solving that you want, and that your business is not operating with silos. Some of the greatest ideas I've ever found is when the marketing person is looking at sales or the salesperson is looking at marketing. That's that classic silo separation. But when one interacts with the other, you'd be amazed, because the commonality of what they've got, as one example, is that they interact with customers. Same with service, right? You throw all those things together, and what you've got is the ability for people to understand that if Dave had an idea and Susan executed that idea, and everybody knows about it, and you celebrate that success, then you're setting people free to know that it's okay to share their ideas. The great thing about that, and I mean that you could change this about anything to do with your business team line management literally today, and you'd start seeing the impact by early next week, because once people see one story of success, everybody's going to start jumping into it. It becomes incredibly powerful from that point of view. So the psychology of permission is just a very literal thing. A lot of it is unconscious. We hold ourselves back without knowing that we're holding ourselves back. It's the same for our teams, really.
Do you not think also, Martin, though, that there's an interesting thing, which is fear also does serve as well? I mean, back to your example of the tiger in the jungle. If I saw a tiger coming at me through some leaves like that, the fear response in my mind would suggest running would be the right thing to do. And actually, it probably would be the right thing to do, rather than, say, trying to pat it on the head. Yeah.
Right.
So I suppose, again, pull it into a business context, and you go, there can be benefits to being fearful, as well as there can be real problems to being fearful as well, right? It can both serve you and it can also hinder you. And you've talked a lot today about hindering, right? So how do you, when you're thinking about a particular situation, pull apart, where is fear my friend and where is fear my foe?
So here's an example of fear being your friend. I'm certainly not enjoying the virus situation. I don't think anybody is, right? But what I did apply to it was, I've worked incredibly hard, like 4 years with no income, and now into my 5th year of launching the business and being commercially active. I've got a lot of opportunities and built up a lot of momentum, and I didn't want to let the virus situation slow that down. And don't get me wrong, like, we're definitely in a period of fear, and that comes with a little bit of panic, and clients are some of them are gonna defer, some of them are gonna delay and stuff. But I wanted to look at it and say, well, if I go out to the world and I do helpfulness and I do things like what we're doing at the moment, but also just make sure that it's not affecting my mindset, what I'm basically doing is what I've always done, which is channeling my fear of failure, and I reconstitute it and make it about my energy. So it's always been the thing that pushes me forward, where I say, right, if I've got this sense of fear, what can I do better? What can I do differently? What can I learn? And that's a huge part about what I'm doing at the moment. So I spent 4 years working on decision making, right? I've got a 400-part mathematical model, woo! But I'm still studying sociology at the moment. I'm looking at Nietzsche's stuff. I'm studying Robin Williams to do with creativity. So you've got to keep moving forward and just rechanneling what you're doing, because there's always opportunity. But it literally comes down to the lens of how you see the world, in my opinion.
Questions from the audience?
Can you talk a little bit about fear of what is right in front of us, stopping us dealing with more important problems that are further out? So I don't know if you want to chip in on this as well, Phil, obviously, because this touches a lot of what you do. But basically, what I see is the reason why people get affected right now is that we're thinking very short term, right? Our brain's being compressed to only think about the now. So I believe that we're in an ultimate period of inertia, right? So if you think about this crisis from a business perspective, is that you're going to go through a full awareness of actually what's going on. And then that's going to come to an ultimate point of inertia. And the reason it'll come to a point of inertia is we've only got a certain capacity to think. So at the moment, we're thinking about life, we're thinking about survival, we're thinking about food, we're thinking about family, and at some point, we're thinking about work, right? So it's kind of quite low on our agenda. So all of those four things that I mentioned are all about short-termism, right? Because the short-term thinking is, how are we going to survive? What's it going to happen? How long am I going to have to stay at home? Is everything going to be okay? Is this going to be my life forever, right? So it leaves very little capacity for us to think long-term. So from a strategic point of view and how to balance it is that I'm thinking about, what do I need to happen in the future, right? So what do I want? And what are the practical steps for me to get there? So for me personally, for my business, is that I'm looking to grow opportunities, grow awareness of what I've got and what I can do. And the bonus for me, and I think this is fair to say, Phil, the reason that we started Recession Rebellion is that Phil and I have always been very aligned from the moment that we met about helpfulness, about wanting to make a difference in the world. And that's got very little to do with, we've got a commercial side, right? We both run our businesses. But I think we both enjoy just kind of liberating people and helping them feel better and find different routes in life. Just curious as to what your thoughts about that.
I think to offer one thing up, I mean, what we're seeing at the moment a lot at Corporate Punk, the team here, is decisions that are being made in fear right now that actually are decisions that will actively work against businesses in the medium term or in the longer term. So a classic example of that is the kind of the overreaction and the overcorrection. So what happens is, because everybody's in kind of reptilian brain panic mode at the moment, there are actually plenty of businesses out there that are impacted by this to a moderate level, or in fact not very much at all, who can overcorrect in how they then try and cut costs at this time. Right. And indeed, even some of the businesses that are being affected profoundly can also overcorrect, and what they can do is the wrong form of surgery on themselves. What that then means, 6 months down the line, when things hopefully start to get a lot more free again in the economy, and we are going to see a massive scramble for market share in a lot of categories, that businesses are going to struggle to scale back up. So one of the things that we're talking a lot to leaders about at the moment is, we may need to batten down the hatches a little bit. We may need to look at how we can conserve costs. Yes, we need to make sure that, to not mix metaphors here, but make sure your own oxygen mask is on first. But at the same time, we need to have a working strategy for how we're actually going to scale back up at the other end. Because if we don't have that working strategy for how we're going to scale back up, then actually we can be doing the wrong things now. And okay, we may have conserved what we've got, but all we've done is built a business which is fundamentally incapable of getting back to anything like anything like the performance it was seeing previously. So I think there is that thing about fear can also force us to overcorrect too.
Yeah, I mean, you could come out of it doing all the conservative things and you've kept yourself safe, and then you're suddenly like, right, we're running out of money, right?
And that's a question ultimately of self-leadership. So next Wednesday, we have my very brilliant colleague at Corporate Punk speaking about self-leadership. So how to connect to your own value as a leader, how to connect to your own sort of essence as a leader, and how to come from that place, and how to make decisions from that place, and how to be brave, and how to make sure that you are thinking clearly when everybody around you is kind of losing their heads. So we'll continue to build on that in next Wednesday's session.
Great. This is a cracking question. So in my experience, clients are happy to embrace radical concepts and courageous ideas until they need to pay for them. So any tips for helping clients to be courageous? So I'll share one piece of IP that I go to all the time for when I'm working on both client delivery. So how can they find more customers, but also how can I convince customers that now is the time to start working with us? And it's called gains and outcomes. So the brain is conditioned to look for gains and outcomes as quickly as possible, whether it's the 3 seconds of view in a website, whether it's above the fold on a website, that you've got to make sure, and it sounds really practical, but most people miss this, particularly in their proposals and their content and how they think about their service, is that you've got to put in what are the gains of what I'm doing and what the outcomes are doing. And the outcomes can be very much about timelines. So if you do this now, this is what you're going to get from it. And the gains, where best possible, should have a numerical component to it. And I'm not just saying that as a mathematician, I'm saying it based on, there's a thing called the secondary conversation, Meaning that if you're selling, let's say you're selling to the CMO, which I do quite a lot of, right? So the chief marketing officer, what does the chief marketing officer have to do when I get them to a point of a decision? They have to turn around and they have to explain it to the CEO, which is my ultimate decision maker, right? So what we always do is make sure that what we've got is super clear, but there's a numerical, understood KPI gain about it. Sorry. So what is that CMO going to do? They're going to turn into the CEO and say, we should do this because this is going to make us 1.6 million, right? It's super clear. That's managing that secondary conversation. And my final tip about it is that particularly in this time, you should download a Zoom link. So just to give you a little bit of credence to this. So my 10 years at British Telecom was all spent in audio, video, web conferencing, right? And the number one thing that I started doing 8 years ago is that every proposal, I never send a Word document. I never send a PDF. What I do is I record a Zoom video. So I walk them through slides, just like we've done today. It keeps it super short, super clear. But the reason why I do it is that 9 out of 10 times they pass it on to the person that's ultimately going to make the decision. So I don't even necessarily ever need to speak to the CEO. But when they hear it from my voice, they get to hear the passion, they get to hear the gains of it, all of it. It just nails it. So I'm sure there's different ways to chop that up, but I thought that was a great question. Any addition to that, Phil?
No, I think that's right. And again, I think, it points to what we were talking about earlier on, which is that fear can serve a helpful purpose as well as as well as an unhelpful purpose. And fear is there in businesses to stop them making bad decisions. So we've got to then go a little bit of a further way to make sure that we're actually helping businesses and convincing businesses that they're making good decisions. Which I think those of us who are in sort of professional services like the creative industries, or like what Martin's doing in psychology, or like what we're doing in organisational development, for example, it can be hard sometimes to think through and to sort of hypothecate the financial outcomes of the work, because actually sometimes what we're doing is increasing optionality. We're actually just helping businesses to be able to do more things than they could do previously. But I don't think that removes the need for us to continue to wrestle with that tiger and to make sure that actually what we are doing is giving as much hard data support what we're inviting clients to do as we possibly can. And to Martin's point, a great way of quashing fear sometimes is facts, and go to the facts, keep going to the facts. And actually, by the way, it is also the best coronavirus coping strategy in the world, is not reading the press, but instead getting all of your information from gov.uk and the NHS is actually a far, far better way of managing fear and managing that kind of reptilian brain than listening to some of the stuff that's being printed in the rags at the moment, or indeed their online versions. And we're probably at time for today, aren't we, I would think?
I've got one more thing to cover, and then I'll hand it back to you to take us out about next week and stuff. So first of all, thanks. The previous question was from Nick. Thank you for that. Here's one from Paul. So Martin, really interesting, thank you. We once worked with Adidas, so jealous, love Adidas, and spent time with the All Blacks. They said that's also amazing. They said one of the ways in which they dealt with pressure to perform / always win was to play what you see, which meant don't think about game strategy, simply trust your instincts as an elite performer and focus on the one thing, keep the ball. Do you think there are lessons we can take from sports psychology? Paul, yes. We just have to reread what you just put. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to share that with the whole group so that everyone can just take it down. And that was wonderful. Phil, why don't you take us out and talk to us about next week and what we've got going on?
Always. So next week we have a fun-packed week. So as always, me up on Tuesday, I shall be talking about remote working, but no, wait, come back. Not another Me Too remote working. You've got to communicate style hack. No, it's going to be the things that nobody thinks about in remote working that actually can transform your productivity and transform your organization's productivity. So that is going to be, I promise you, a really interesting session. On Wednesday, as I mentioned earlier on, we have Claire joining us. Claire is going to talk about self-leadership. She is an absolutely peerless executive coach, and we'll have a load of good stuff to share there. And then Martin is back with us on Thursday talking about the psychological techniques that will power innovation. So one of the things we're trying to do here is make sure that we're encouraging people to design and ship new things, which is kind of what we need to be doing in response to what's going on out there. So thinking about mindset and psychology and actually what the tools and techniques that you need to be able to do that and do that well. So that is next week, and we will send out, there'll be a newsletter come out about all that, so we have the times and everything else on there. But in the meantime, as I say, that's it for this week. All spreading of the word, really appreciated. As you'll see on screen, Martin and I are also continuing to offer, if you've got problems, come and talk to us about them. You hopefully have a sense of what's good for Martin and what's good to talk to me and my gang about. But make sure you do that if there's things going on that you want some help and support around. And we will look forward to seeing you next week. That has been the first week of Recession Rebellion. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.